If one day you were given power, what would you do with it? Imagine walking into a place you've never been before, thinking it's just a simple experiment. Nothing dangerous, nothing serious. Just a few days, and then you go back to your normal life. But then, something begins to change. Small rules start to feel stricter. The air feels colder. And ordinary people begin to act in ways even they don't understand. No one is forcing them. No one is telling them to be cruel. It's just that they can. And sometimes that alone is enough to change a person. This isn't a fictional story. This really happened. In 1971, inside a well-known American university, a psychological experiment blurred the line between right and wrong, between who we are and the roles we play. In less than a week, everything spiraled out of control. The participants stopped pretending. They became the role. And the most unsettling part, it could happen to anyone. And to understand how things went so far, we have to go back to the beginning. Before the fear, before the control, before anyone changed. At first, everything felt completely normal. It was 1971. America was going through a turbulent time. But on a quiet university campus, life moved on as usual. Students went to class, talked with friends, and looked for opportunities. Among them were young men who came across a small newspaper ad, a paid psychology study lasting a few days. It didn't seem like a big deal. Just a way to earn some extra money. Maybe even a story to tell later. The participants selected were as ordinary as they come. No criminal records, no signs of psychological trouble. They could have been your neighbor, your classmate, maybe even you. None of them knew that in just a few days, they would be placed into a situation they had never imagined. The study would later become known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. But in the beginning, it didn't feel dangerous. It was just a simple question. If people are assigned roles, how far will they go in playing them? To find out, a mock prison was built in the basement of the university. It didn't look terrifying at first, just walls, doors, and a few metal bars. And one simple rule: some would be guards, others would be prisoners. Just roles. At least, that's what they believed. No one expected that those roles would begin to feel real. And once that line started to blur, everything began to change. And then, everything was put into place. What started as a simple idea was turned into something real. Not in a real prison, but in the basement of a university. Cold concrete hallways were divided. Doors were reinforced. Metal bars were installed. Harsh white lights cast a sterile glow, creating a space that felt controlled, confined. It wasn't perfect, but it was convincing enough. Convincing enough to make you forget this was just an experiment. The participants were split into two groups, completely at random. Half became guards. The other half became prisoners. There was no difference between them before. No one was better, no one was worse. Just assigned roles. The guards were given uniforms, khaki shirts, dark sunglasses, and batons. They were told to maintain order, but not to use physical violence. The prisoners, on the other hand, lost almost everything familiar. They wore plain smocks. They were identified by numbers instead of names. No identity, no control. And then something unexpected happened. The prisoners didn't simply walk into the experiment. They were arrested at their homes by real police officers. Handcuffed, taken away, processed like actual criminals. From that moment on, something shifted. This was no longer just a game. No longer a simple role to play. As they stepped into that prison, wearing numbers on their chests, part of who they were began to change. And on the other side of the bars, those given power began to feel something too. Not because they were told to change, but because the situation was already shaping them. And then the shift began. Not after weeks, not even after days. Just within the first few hours. At first, it still felt like an experiment. The guards were a bit unsure, adjusting to their new roles. The prisoners tried to stay relaxed. Some even laughed, treating it lightly. But then, the atmosphere changed. Rules were repeated more often. Voices grew firmer. Small commands started to appear again and again. Stand up straight. Be quiet. Do it again. No one explicitly told the guards to act this way. But power has a voice of its own. The guards began to realize they were in control. And once they felt that, they started to see how far they could go. Not through obvious violence, but through subtle control. Making prisoners repeat rules, waking them in the middle of the night, letting them feel like they were always being watched. On the other side, the prisoners began to change too. The laughter faded. Their eyes became cautious, their movements slower. Some started to obey without question, not because they were weak, but because the environment was quietly reshaping them. What's striking is this: no one stopped it. No one stepped back and said, "This is just an experiment." Because by now, it didn't feel like one anymore. It was becoming real. A reality where power and submission existed side by side, feeding into each other. In a very short time, ordinary people were already behaving in ways they probably never imagined. And this was only the beginning. And then, something no one expected happened. The shift didn't stop. It kept going and going until it reached a point of no return. Within just a few days, the atmosphere inside that prison had completely changed. The early tension was gone. This was no longer a mild experiment. It felt heavy. The guards were no longer just maintaining order. They were asserting control. Commands became more frequent, more demanding. Punishments were no longer simple corrections. They were repeated, prolonged, and at times deeply humiliating. There was little physical force, but the psychological pressure kept building. On the other side, the prisoners began to break. Some couldn't sleep. Some showed signs of panic. A few reached a point where they simply couldn't continue and had to be removed early. They were no longer reacting like participants playing a role. They were reacting like real people, pushed to their limits. And perhaps the most unsettling part wasn't what was happening. It was how naturally it unfolded. No one stepped in to say, "This has gone too far." No one fully recognized the line that had been crossed. Even the observers slowly began to accept it as part of the experiment. The line between right and wrong started to blur. The line between who they were and the roles they were playing almost disappeared. The guards no longer felt like they were pretending. They began to believe in their authority. The prisoners no longer felt like they could simply walk away. They began to feel trapped. And in that moment, this was no longer just a study. It became a situation where people began to lose themselves. Not because they were inherently cruel, but because the environment had taken them somewhere they never imagined they could go. A place where behavior wasn't guided by reason, but by roles, pressure, and power. And once that happens, the question is no longer, what will they do next? It becomes, can they ever go back to who they were at all? And then, in the middle of it all, someone finally said, "Stop." After days of things slowly slipping out of control, that prison had become something else entirely. No one inside was really seeing it as an experiment anymore. The behavior, the emotions, it all felt too real. But sometimes, all it takes is one person standing outside of it to see things clearly. That person was Christina Maslow. She wasn't part of the experiment from the beginning. She hadn't been pulled into the gradual changes. She hadn't grown used to what was happening. And because of that, when she walked in, she saw everything the way it should have been seen. Not as roles, not as a study, but as real people being treated in ways that should never happen. She saw exhausted prisoners, emotionally drained, guards who had grown cold, controlling, as if it were completely normal. And what shocked her most was that no one was stopping it. No one was questioning it. No one was saying, "This isn't right." Even Philip Zimbardo, the man leading the experiment, had become part of it. He was no longer just a researcher observing from the outside. He had taken on the role of the prison superintendent. And when you're that deep inside a situation, it's easy to forget why you were there in the first place. But Christina Maslow didn't forget. She spoke up, not with complicated arguments. Just a simple question. Is this really okay? One question, but it broke the silence. It made people stop and look again. And in that moment, the experiment ended. Not after 2 weeks, as planned, but after just 6 days. 6 days to turn an idea into a lesson the world would never forget. And what matters most isn't just what happened. It's that someone had the courage to say, stop. Because sometimes the hardest thing isn't seeing that something is wrong. It's finding the courage to speak up. And when it finally stopped, the silence began to speak. No more commands, no more heavy footsteps echoing through the halls. Just one quiet question lingering in the air. What just happened? The participants slowly left that prison. They returned to their normal lives. But what they experienced in those few days didn't simply fade away. Because it wasn't just an experiment. It was a mirror. A mirror reflecting something very real about human nature. We like to believe we know ourselves. That in difficult situations, we would hold on to what's right and wrong. That we would stay true to who we are. But this experiment suggested otherwise. When the environment changes, people change. When power is introduced, behavior shifts. And when no one speaks up, the line between right and wrong can blur more easily than we think. What's unsettling isn't that the people in the study were different. It's that they were just like us. They weren't bad people. They were ordinary individuals placed in an extraordinary situation. And that situation shaped what they became. Maybe the real lesson isn't about judging what happened. It's about understanding this. Any of us can be influenced more than we'd like to admit. So the real question isn't, would I have acted like them? It's this. If I were in that situation, would I even notice myself changing? And more importantly, would anyone, maybe even me, have the awareness to stop? And maybe that's why this story is still told today. Not because it belongs to the past, but because, in many ways, it's still with us. We don't live inside a prison like that experiment, but we do live within roles. In our families, at work, in society. And sometimes, those roles can quietly shape how we think, how we treat others. Power doesn't always come in big, obvious forms. Sometimes it's small. A word we choose, a decision we make, the way we respond to someone in front of us. This story isn't saying people are inherently bad. It's reminding us that people are deeply influenced by their surroundings. And because of that, what matters isn't the role we're given. It's whether we still recognize who we are while we're in it.